The first thing we're going to talk about is the preferences. And now I'm not going to tell you how to set your preferences because the whole point of preferences, well, they're your preference. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the key settings that you may or may not want to consider because they'll have an influence on the way you work. But again, the key to preferences is this is one of the places where you can really customize Photoshop to work the way you want to either turn things on or off. So we're here in the general preferences, and to start off, a couple of things. For example, here, use Shift key for tool switch. That's been around for an awful long time, so if you want to using the letters, for example, M for marquee, Shift M would select the elliptical marquee. That's the way it's been for a long time, but some people want to just have the ability to press a single key, just M and press M again. So this is on by default, but you can turn it off. Personally, I like to keep resize image during paste or place. That means it automatically scales it down to fit within the document size, which often I want to do anyway, so that just happens automatically. A couple things that are off that you may want to consider: zoom. If you have a mouse with a scroll wheel, you can turn that on. Now this is something that was introduced in CS4, is this flick panning, where you can sort of flick your mouse, or if you're using a trackpad or the tablet, to kind of smoothly scroll across. Now some people like it, some people don't. I have it turned on, but you may decide to leave it off. Down at the bottom, it also talks about the history log, and that's if you want to actually save the history log. So in other words, it doesn't actually save the history. It doesn't change the fact you can't go back and change what you've done, but it gives you the ability to have like a text file. A lot of people like to have this if they want to kind of track what they've done to an image. They'll have a document attached which tells them all that. Oh, and by the way, up at the top, this is also important. This is the default setting for the interpolation that image size uses. So if you know you're going to be spending a lot of time enlarging or reducing photos, you could pick something else. And that reminds me to make an important point about preferences. Preferences will stay set this way until you change them again. So there's nothing wrong with changing a preference for the next couple of hours. For example, if I know I'm going to be spending the next couple of hours taking images that are big and making them smaller, then I would change my default to this, because then every time I go to image size, I don't have to change it. Just remember, once you do change it, it stays this way. So let's go to the next one, and this is the interface preferences as to how you want Photoshop to look. So a lot of these you may or may not want to change. This is again a personal preference as to how it looks. I've left mine the standard default way that it works. I used to show my channels in color when I was looking at the red, green, and blue channels, but now I mostly use channels, or often use them as a selection method, so seeing them in kind of a black and white or grayscale method just makes better sense. Now this is something I turn it off and on at will. Show tooltips. Initially it can be very useful, as you see right there, so it has that little pop-up tooltips, but once you get to the point of knowing what you're doing, you may choose to turn this off, because sometimes frankly the tooltips kind of get in the way. As far as the panels, you can decide whether you want to have the panels auto show and hide. So if you're in full screen view, probably the one that causes the most concern for people in CS4 is this one, open documents as tabs. Personally, I really like tabs. I've got used to them. I really like the way they work, so I have mine turned on. If you wish not to do that, if you want to have it back to the quote old way of working in Photoshop where you just want everything as a separate window, you can turn that off. But personally, I leave it on. Down at the bottom, it talks about the interface and whether we want the fonts to be a small size or larger size. Take note of this right here. You'll see this every so often, and it says that certain ones will only take effect the next time you start Photoshop, meaning these ones here. Now all these other ones don't. So if you decide to show tooltips on and off, you just click OK and then go back, turn them on again. Ones like this, anytime you see this warning symbol, means you have to actually restart Photoshop for it to take effect. All right. Let's look at the next. File handling. I always prefer to save an image preview as an icon. I always have these turned on. I always want the file extension and lowercase. That's kind of standard, but that's the way I find just makes sense to me when I'm working. You'll also see there is a separate Camera Raw preference setting, which obviously applies to when you open Camera Raw files. It involves things like, do you want to have sharpening applied, what kind of default image settings. And again, I'm just showing you where these are so you can decide what you want to do with them, whether you want them on or off. Probably the biggest thing down at the bottoms is since Camera Raw can open both JPEGs and TIFFs, we have some choices down here. You can either turn it off completely, which I wouldn't necessarily suggest. This is the one that I have it set on. This means if I've already opened a JPEG in Camera Raw, it will continue to open in Camera Raw. I prefer that over this one because I don't want every single JPEG open in Camera Raw. I just want individual ones. So that's why I have it set on here. The same for TIFF. Down at the bottom, it asks me here, under File Compatibility, asks me whether I want to ask before saving layer TIFF files. I do because sometimes I want layers and TIFFs, sometimes I don't. Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. I used to have this set to ask, but then you know what? I have it set to always. The main thing it does is it makes your file size a little bit larger because it involves what amounts to a flattened version with your layer document. Now, there's not a whole lot of programs that take advantage of that, but my philosophy is if it adds just a little bit to my file size, I'd rather have that on just in case. It is very useful when you're using Lightroom because it has an influence in the way Lightroom works with Photoshop documents. Personally, I would turn version queue off. I don't use it, so there's no reason to have it. And then for me, 10 files in the recent file list is sufficient. I could use more, I suppose, but that works for me. I really don't change these settings very much unless I run into a problem, and I'm currently working on a laptop that has a decent amount of memory. For me, having 20 states in history so I can go back 20 steps generally is enough. If I'm working on a project where I'm thinking I want to give myself more flexibility, I could make this a little higher. Or if I want to really, if I'm working on a big intensive project where I think I need more allocation of memory, one way to do that would be to lower the history states down to a lower number. Once again, I will use the same warning, and that is when if you change this, don't forget to change it back again. I have 2 drives set up. Now I could set this other one up as a scratch disk, but really it's a backup drive more for things like Time Machine on the Macintosh. So I've yet to run into an issue where I get a message saying your scratch disk is full. If I did, I could turn this on. One of the advantages of CS4, of course, is this OpenGL drawing setting. I leave that on. As of yet, I have not had a problem with it. And it tells you down at the bottom, if you hover over this, it shows you what this OpenGL activates. All right, on to our next setting, which is our cursor. Generally, I keep these set just as you see them here. This is the default setting. I want to see the normal brush tip. I want the cursors to be standard, and when I preview the brush size, red. That works for me. I just leave those as is. Now here's something that occasionally I change. If I'm working on a project where I know I'm going to be turning the visibility of layers on and off, and I've got a lot of small text, and maybe that text is white, over the years I found it's awful hard to see white type if it's on a white grid like this. So one of the things that you can do, and I often do, is I pick some color that I know is not going to be involved in my project, like pink, and then I make my grid pink and a darker gray. Now it's going to be real easy to see white text on here. And again, I just got to remember once I do this to change it back again, I can just go back to one of these built-in settings. In units and rulers, this is where I set up my units of measurement. Pretty standard here, nothing that I typically change. The only exception of that will be this column size. If I know I'm setting up a document to use in InDesign and that my column is a certain width in picas or points or whatever it might be, or even inches, I can say I know that it's 2.65 inches, and this means now when I'm going to create new documents or use image size, one of the options for me is to measure not only in things like inches and pixels, but also in columns, so it'll do the math for me. Again, not something we use very often, but it's nice to know it's there if we need it. Next is where we talked about guides and smart guides and grid. Most of the things here I don't change very often. I leave them as is, with the possible exception of grid. If I'm doing a project where I want to have different options, I can go and change the settings for my grid lines. That's about the only thing I might change this for. The other one that if I'm not doing any web work, I would turn off show slice numbers, because if you happen to even click on the slice tool by mistake, you'll get those little tiny numbers in the corner of your document. It's just a little distracting, so if you don't need them, you can turn them off here. Over in the plugins, it just basically allows us to say that do we want to have any additional plugins folder, which I've never had the need to do, but you could. And the extensions, this is new to CS4 with the flash panels where people can create their own panels using Configurator or ones that you download. And that's what this allows me to do, and this is another one that will only take effect if you restart Photoshop. So the last one is type preferences. Again, I typically don't change this unless I specifically have a reason to go in and do that, for example, to make a larger font preview size or something, but I've found this works pretty well. If you find that it's taking an awful long time to scroll through your font menu, you may wish to just turn that preview off if you already know what your fonts look like. That's, again, a personal choice. So let's do this. Let's just create a situation here where I'm going to show you the kind of thing that I might use this for, just as one quick example. So I'm going to put in some text, but it's not going to be that big. It's going to be much smaller. Okay, not that small, but pretty small. And I want to edit that type. Actually, I want to make it white, though. So I turn off the background, and there, see, there's my preference I'd set up previously for the transparency background. So let me show you how I can change this kind of on the fly. It's kind of interesting. If I can go down to the one I know I need, which is transparency and gamut, I can go back to light, click OK. Now I see what I mean about how hard it is to see the type. So if I want to change that now, instead of having to go back and find it, I just do this. The keyboard shortcut for preferences is Command or Control K, but if you want to jump to the last preference you just used, you add in the Option or Alt key. So on the Mac it'd be Command Option K, Windows Control Alt K, and this is what it does. It jumps you right back here, so now once again I can pick some setting, and you can sort of see in the background that's actually showing you. So if you want to make sure this looks good, so you can really see what you're doing, there we go, that's a little easier to see. Now some people might not want to change that at all, but I'm really again just showing you this as an example of how preferences can be set on the fly. They shouldn't be thought of only as overall performance of Photoshop. That's a big part of it, but it's also very useful, as we saw here, to just change your preferences kind of on the fly when you need to.